One Florida man would not only see UFOs on multiple occasions, he even captured multiple pictures and even a couple of videos of them too. What was first thought of as one of the most convincing UFO cases ever recorded would slowly, over a decade, make its descent into hoax status. But even so, that doesn't mean some still don't have their reasons for still believing. Now let's take a look into this case from the very beginning to understand why people are still torn on the validity of these photos even to this day. Gulf Breeze, Florida is a smaller town located outside of Pensacola, in the far west panhandle of the state. In the later 1980s, the town only had a population of around 6,000 people. But even so, within just a few years, over 200 UFO sightings would be made in the area. Even stranger is that over 135 of these were reported just between November 1987 through July 1988. And within these reports, one local man, Ed Walters, would be mentioned over 30 different times. Ed was happily married and had a couple of kids, living a fairly normal life. He was a 39-year-old building contractor who was working from home on the night of November 11th, 1987. He was sitting in his study when he glanced out the window to see an amazingly bright yellow and orange light shining through the dusk on the west horizon. Immediately curious as to what this was, he got up and peered out the window, and to his surprise, he could see some kind of glowing object hovering in the sky. However, his view was mostly obscured by trees, so he decided to step outside for a better look. But as soon as he got out there, he knew that this was no normal aircraft. It was top-shaped, with a circle of bright lights on the bottom of the craft. On the flat sides, he could see square windows separated by some kind of markings. He suddenly had the thought to run inside and grab his camera, soon returning to the front yard with his Polaroid. He took a couple of pictures as fast as he could, but he still wanted a better view. He began to walk down the street, snapping 3 more pictures as he grew closer to the craft. But after a moment, it started to move in his direction, almost as if the craft saw him coming. It hovered right above him, and with no warning, a bright blue light shot out from the underside of this flying object. This was no normal light either. As it struck him, it lifted him several feet off the ground. His entire body was engulfed by this blue light. He later said, "I was trying to breathe, but my chest wouldn't expand." Right then, he would hear a bizarre voice in his head saying, "We will not harm you." But this just frightened Walters even more, and he began to scream at the top of his lungs, telling them to put him down. It was now that he started smelling something in the air, reminding him of ammonia and a lot of cinnamon. As he yelled, it seemed to leave a burned taste in the back of his throat. He would say that next it seemed like pages were flipping through his mind as various images were shown to him in his head. He began to hear a humming sound, and before he knew it, he was waking up in a daze on the front lawn. Looking around, he could tell that the craft wasn't nearby anymore. He went back inside his house and decided to call it a night. He had his photos, but it would be a whole week before he would decide to do anything with them. On the afternoon of November 17th, he would contact the local newspaper, the Gulf Breeze Sentinel. Ed then met with an editor and showed him the 5 pictures and told him the story behind the case. Unsure of what this might do to his reputation, he first made the report under the pseudonym Jim, telling them that it was actually his neighbor that made the sighting. But before his Polaroids could even be published, he would make another sighting. On the night of November 20th, Walters claims to have been hearing a hum similar to what he heard in the first encounter, as well as what he thought were voices. He immediately stopped what he was doing and went outside to see what was going on. It didn't take him long to see a glowing orb-like craft descending from the sky. It soon began to hover in place, allowing him to grab his camera and take one more picture. By the 25th, his pictures and encounter would be on the front page of the paper. Interestingly, the paper also included 6 other accounts from witnesses of strange flying objects in the same area. Then, just 1 week after this, Ed and 6 other people would report seeing a beam of blue light coming from the bottom of another top-shaped craft. Walters was able to take 1 picture of it before it quickly left the area. Strangely, the next day, a man only known as Believer Bill would mail a couple of his own photos into the newspaper, and these seemed to show a very similar, if not the same craft. And although this has never been proven to be true, the sender would claim that his pictures had been taken a full year before Ed's. Then, just 2 nights after this, Ed would make another sighting. He would mysteriously be woken up in the middle of the night. Out of curiosity, he would again go outside and see the strange glowing object in the sky above the nearby high school. It soon started to descend towards the ground, before he lost sight of it. And although he couldn't tell if it had fully landed or not, he would soon come to find a flattened patch of grass right below where the object had been. He decided to take a couple pictures of this spot too, before heading back home. Then it would be quiet for a few weeks, before the paper would once again get a couple more pictures from Believer Bill, this time showing multiple flying objects. And then, the very next day, on Christmas Eve, Ed would once again see objects up in the sky. He was able to take several pictures, as well as one video that it seems he would only give to investigators later on. And even though it was the end of 1987, the encounters definitely would not end here. Walters would say that one of the closest encounters he would ever have took place on January 12, 1988. He was driving on the rural part of Soundside Drive, just 4 blocks away from his house, and he was claimed that he was forced off the road after a bright white beam shot down at him from a craft overhead. He screeched to a stop about 600 feet down the road and got out to take another Polaroid picture. It appeared to be the same object he had previously seen, but it was much closer, hovering just above the road with a yellow glow beneath it. It seems at this time he didn't report this encounter and instead would save it for his book. About 3 weeks after this, he would photograph his wife, covered in a blue light, while running from another craft in the sky. Many wonder why he photographed his wife instead of helping her, but it seems that he's never really given a good reason for this. But by now, many around Gulf Breeze had either heard of Ed Walters' encounters or seen some of his pictures. This would grab the attention of MUFON, who would soon contact Walters in order to conduct an investigation into his claims. Almost right away, they were impressed with his account and the quality of the photos, but they still weren't quite ready to say that it was all completely genuine. They would look into the pictures, but due to how the object was always positioned against the sky, it was difficult to tell just how big or far away the craft really was. Some would estimate that it was about 15 feet across, while others guessed that it was about 40 feet in diameter. So, the investigators would end up giving him a tamper-proof stereo camera, which would make it much harder for him to fake any future pictures, if he faked the first ones. After this, they would start to interview others around town, and ended up hearing about quite a few other sightings too. One of these even happened the same day as Ed's original encounter, November 11th, 1987. Sometime in the early afternoon, witness Arthur Hufford and his wife would report seeing a hovering object in the trees that closely matched Walter's photos. And they wouldn't have even been aware of these yet, as it was still before they would have been published in the paper. Arthur was reported to be quiet, sober, intelligent, and someone you, quote, would trust to tell the truth. It seems that within just a few days of this, another man, Dr. McConnell, would make a report almost identical to Arthur's, in which he and his wife saw a hovering light in the sky. Although he was known to have some extreme views and exotic notions, Dr. McConnell was still quite well respected within the Gulf Breeze community. These sightings would continue to be reported constantly up until about July 1988. At this point, most of them were being reported directly to MUFON, but many were still going to the Gulf Breeze Sentinel. Out of all of these, over 80 cases would involve multicolored lights in a circular aircraft. Nearly all of them would say that it was silent as it flew, with some saying that while it was hovering, it only moved about 4 or 5 miles an hour. Some would say that the lights were orange and yellow, while others said that they were more gray and white. And overall, most would describe an oval shape with some kind of dome on the top. One resident would capture a video with one of these flying lights, with what appeared to be 2 military jets flying nearby. It seems that Walters would continue to make sightings too. On September 12th, he would take pictures of a red glowing object flying far away in the night sky. What makes this even more interesting, though, is it seems that 35 people attending Pensacola's Unity Church would all report seeing this very same object that night. Soon, MUFON's over 5-month-long analysis of the videos and photos given to them by Ed would be concluded. They would claim that the object seen is not a model, nor was it some kind of remote-controlled toy. Navy optical physicist and investigator from MUFON, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, would call this a classic UFO photograph. He estimated it to be about 9 feet tall and 12 or 13 feet in diameter. Overall, he thought this was some of the most convincing pictures and credible case that he had ever come across. But not everyone would feel the same way. Even many in the UFO community, for example, the Center for UFO Studies, had problems with Walter's photos and didn't want to say that they were authentic just yet. One ufologist, Zan Overall, would claim that he discovered that Walters was knowledgeable in double exposure techniques, and he believed that he just took a picture of the sky and then grabbed a toy or model and took a picture of it on the same piece of film, and this would merge the two images together. But others were quick to point out that in a couple of the pictures, the craft is actually behind the trees, which would be nearly impossible to accomplish with double exposure techniques. Others would dig up his past run-ins with the law in an attempt to discredit him. They would show that back in '67, he was actually arrested for forgery and auto theft and served a 1.5 years in prison. And although this did hurt his image a little bit, most investigators just shrugged it off. The story was beginning to spread around the US, and now many others would start to point out their own problems with the photos as well. It seems that many doubted the authenticity due to how the light from the craft didn't seem to be reflecting off nearby trees or light poles. Others would say that the craft doesn't appear to actually be flying and looks to be resting on some unseen flat surface. But even those that wanted to believe that Ed's photos were real still needed to investigate them for themselves. The National Enquirer would even hire NASA photo expert Dr. Robert Nathan to analyze the pictures. But in the end, he wasn't even sure if the pictures were fake or not from a technical point of view. In his opinion, though, he thought it must have been made with some sort of cut-and-paste method that he apparently wasn't aware of. What leads him to believe this is that the craft either seemed to be too bright or too in or out of focus compared to the background in many of the pictures. Other researchers would be convinced that the pictures were simply created with the reflections of a light fixture on some glass panel that's set in his front yard. Some journalists from a local newspaper would even try to recreate Ed's photos using this method. They would do this in a secluded area with conditions very similar to Walter's, yet the newspaper photos wouldn't turn out nearly as clear or convincing. They would add that the whole setup was a bit labor-intensive and pretty noticeable. It seems that they would even contact Ed's neighbors, but none would ever report seeing him setting up something like this in front of his house. Soon, Ware TV would try to recreate the photos themselves using double exposure, and it seems that the crew would actually go out to his house to attempt this. They first lit up a model and set it against orange-gray paper cutout in front of a large black backdrop. The second photo, which would be on the same film frame, was then taken focusing over the nearby road. Again, the results were pretty similar to Ed's photos, but still not nearly as clear. They would add that to recreate the ones behind the trees, they would have to make a special cutout piece for the tree branch and then line it up perfectly, which of course is nearly impossible. They would also say that Ed's photos didn't look to be a merge between two pictures like theirs did. And they even said that half of these pictures were actually taken on a tamper-proof MUFON stereo camera that would have been hard to double expose with. To double expose on this camera, he would have had to somehow stop the film motor from spinning without opening up the camera itself. They would come to the conclusion that Ed's photos were not created in this fashion. He would keep making sightings during the next year, too. Walters even captured one in daylight hours in the sky above the beach. He recorded it for a moment before it shot off at an amazing speed. At this point, he was practically a celebrity in Florida. He was appearing on multiple TV programs across the state. He even signed a book deal, with the promise to show more pictures and details from his encounters within. Around this time, people curious about his encounters were beginning to knock on his door all hours of the day. Since he now had a good chunk of money from his TV and book deals, he decided it would be a good time to move to a new house. So, in December 1988, the family moved to an undisclosed location while the old house was put onto the market. However, a possible chance discovery in his old house over a year later would soon add to the suspicions around Ed Walters' encounters. In November 1989, the house finally sold to the couple Bob and Sarah Lee Menzer. 5 months later, some say that Bob went into the attic to install a water line to an ice maker, while others claim that it was to fix a broken pipe that appeared to have been purposefully broken. But either way, Bob would find a styrofoam model wrapped in Ed's drafting paper, nearly identical to the object seen in many of Ed's photos. The Menzers claim that since they were from the Washington, D.C. area, they had no knowledge of the photos at that time. They thought it was just a kid's toy left over from the last occupants and just left it where it was in the attic for the time being. In the early 1990s, Walter's first book would come out, and this included many photos that hadn't been seen before. On an interesting note, before Dr. Nathan's analysis of the photos, the book was actually called UFOs, Proof Positive, before being changed to The Gulf Breeze Sightings, when the analysis came back inconclusive. And even after this came out, he would still make more sightings. On January 8th, Ed and his wife were taking a walk around the neighborhood when they would see a strange red object flying in the sky. They soon got some neighbors out to witness the object for themselves. Ed tried to get a couple pictures, but said it was moving too fast for a good one. He then handed his camera over to his friend, Chip Holston, who was able to catch the object while it was hovering for a split second before changing direction, leading to a clearer photo. Around this time, a Gulf Breeze City Councilwoman, Brendan Pollack, would make her own sighting, even capturing an exposure of the object moving across the sky, giving it a look of a colored streak. One expert would say that the flying object changed colors 110 times within the 3-second exposure. Many believe it to be the same thing that Ed and Chip had photographed together. Around this time, some researchers would even give him a couple of polygraph tests, which he was said to have passed. All of this was now giving him a good boost to his credibility. However, this boost wouldn't last too long. In June 1990, a reporter, Craig Myers, from Pensacola News Journal, decided to visit the new residents of Ed's old house, the Menzers. Wanting to know if they had anything to add to this story, Bob Menzer quickly produced the model and gave it to Myers. The 9-inch by 6-inch model was clearly made from styrofoam plates, cardboard, paper, and a tinted blue plastic. It had a 6-inch orange paper ring for the top, a 3-inch plastic tube as its middle, and a 2-inch paper ring and electrical tape for its bottom. And just a week later, on June 10th, this reporter would publish a story about the model. Walters was quick to sign a statement claiming that he had no knowledge of the model's existence, but refused to take any more polygraph tests. The Menzers would sign a similar statement, saying that they had no idea who actually created it. Ed even suggested that the government could have done it in an attempt to discredit him. But when the model was more closely investigated, they would find Ed's handwriting all over the draft paper it was originally wrapped in. Ed would say that someone must have pulled it from the trash, stating that it was from a plan for a house in 1989 that eventually fell through. Looking into this, investigators would find him partially right, but believed it was actually from a plan from an earlier house in 1987, before his encounter actually took place, making the stolen trash theory much less likely. It seems that this is one point that people still argue about, as there is no solid proof either way. Ed would suggest that someone must have planted the model in the house while it was empty, but no one in the area had ever seen any break-ins or anything. Ed would say that if he really did fake it with the model, leaving it behind in the move would have just been idiotic of him. However, he did acknowledge that the model looked very similar to the object seen in the photos. And this wouldn't be the end of Ed's troubles either. Just a week after the article about the model was published, a local 20-year-old man named Tommy Smith, who was friends with Ed's son, Dan, would come forward with his own claims. He would say that he actually helped Walters make some of the earlier photos, and even still had some that they had taken together and never sent in to the newspapers. He would say that he had the model perched on top of a pipe with a flashlight on a tripod shining right onto it. They then took the picture before double exposing the film against the sky. Smith also claimed that the blue light in the photos were made by peeling back a layer of the film. He would even say that they made the landing spot by turning a trampoline upside down and stomping down the plants. He even said that he felt the whole thing was pretty phony to him, so he just quit helping after a while. but he still didn't know how Ed created the later photographs. And even though many people did immediately believe Tommy and abandon Ed, this didn't happen with everyone. Film experts were quick to point out that you can't peel film in the way that Tommy Smith describes. Others would go out to the landing spot and point out that the grass still hadn't grown back years later, and were unwilling to believe that this was caused by a trampoline. It also seems that Tommy wasn't aware of the recreation done by Ware TV with the double exposure claim, and this just hurt his credibility. Future investigators were unable to even show that Tommy Smith had ever even known or met Ed Walters at all. And although many believe Tommy's word, many others doubt the young man's claims altogether. It was also found that one member of Smith's family was running for city council against a member of Walters' family. This may just be a coincidence, but some think it was an attempt to make the Walter family look bad. But others would come forward around this time as well. Several people from around town would say that Ed was known to be a prankster. One woman, Jennifer Bloomberg, even said that she was pranked by a photo he made with double exposure. It seems that he showed her a picture he had taken of her with some kind of ghost or apparition in the background, and it actually fooled her for a while. But with that said, she would never really provide much to back up her claim. Skeptics would now also accuse Ed as being the mysterious believer Bill, but he would deny all these claims too. With many people still completely torn on the validity of this case, it was still being researched by many even years later. Soon his book was being picked through and analyzed as well. And this is where one specific photo would come into the spotlight as the most probable fake. This would be the picture taken on January 12, 1988, of the craft hovering above the road. One expert will come out and say that the reflection of the craft's light on the road was nearly 9 times larger than it should have been, and appeared to actually be in mid-air, pointing to the use of a model. However, others would point out that the craft or the light could have just been at an odd angle, and the reflections don't really prove anything. But it seems that even with some still backing Walters up, many were losing faith in him and his pictures. Now even MUFON was taking back everything they had said before, now stating that they had, quote, entered this investigation with a natural and favorable bias towards the Walters case. But our investigation and analysis led to the conclusion that several, if not all of the photos, are probable hoaxes. The Center for UFO Studies would come to a similar conclusion. After examining the windows of the craft, they believed them to be painted on, as they weren't at all shaped or spaced evenly at all. They would also point out that the bottom wasn't completely symmetrical, with a flaw able to be seen in the bottom ring of some of the photos. They claimed that it could have possibly been done by taking pictures of the model reflected off the surface of some water. They also say that in one of the older pictures with the blue beam, you can actually see a support pole in the background. But Ed denies all of this and claims that many of the photos look the way they do because the object was usually still in motion while it was hovering. But countering this statement, others say that the pictures feel too perfect if the object was really moving like he said, and it shouldn't always be nearly in the center of the frame. But even if these organizations do think that Walter's case was a hoax, it doesn't really mean that everything in the area was. There were many other sightings reported, and even a few other videos taken. In 1991, MUFON investigator Carol and her husband Rex Salisbury were still investigating the area, and eventually concluded that most of the sightings were caused by the nearby Air Force bases, and many of them were probably flares. But then they were soon let go from their positions, with them claiming it was because they didn't believe the incident was caused by UFOs. However, others believed that they were fired because their explanation clearly only fit a few of the sightings, and didn't explain the vast majority of them. Pensacola Naval Air Station, Eglin Air Force Base, Hurlburt Field, and several smaller facilities would even come out and say that they hadn't seen any unusual activity, and denied even sending planes after any of these flying objects. Many do think that the Army could have been experimenting with new aircraft, but others wonder why they would fly them over a populated area if that was the case. And although sightings in the area were beginning to slow down, they were still fairly frequent compared to other locations. In 1993, a local UFO researcher, Bland Pugh, would capture a photo of another similar flying object. Then, in 1995, a ufologist researching sightings in Gulf Breeze was able to take his own video of a craft that many believe to be related to the one seen in Ed's photos. A top-shaped hovering craft in the sky, with an odd streak of light passing around the outside shell. Ed Walters wasn't done making books after all this either. Sometime in the mid-90s, he began to undergo hypnotic memory regression therapy, adding everything he uncovered into his new writings. It seems that Ed would never waver during all of this either, and even though he and his wife divorced, they would publish a second book about his encounters in 1994. He would even now claim to have been abducted 4 different times and have over 100 sightings in total. He also sketched out some of the aliens he had seen, which appeared to be 4-foot-tall humanoid creatures in metallic suits. He claimed that they spoke to him telepathically. Calling him Zehas, they said things like, "We have come for you. You will not be harmed. Do not be afraid. Do not resist us. And do not deny us." In his writings, he also claimed that on one occasion, a couple of government agents came by his house with a warrant for his pictures. But they just simply left after he told them that he already handed them over to a reporter. But it seems that this book of his would be about the last of the new information for this case. By the late 1990s, both Ed and other citizens of Gulf Breeze wouldn't really be making nearly as many sightings anymore. Although most agreed that something was happening over the area, not everyone believed the sightings to have been caused by UFOs. Most people now believe that Ed Walters' photos, as well as many of the others taken in the area, were all faked. They just don't know exactly how. Some think that he may have just done all of this for money. Looking into it, it seems that he was paid a $100,000 advance just for his first book. It was also reported that ABC paid him nearly $400,000 for the rights to use his images on TV. Following the money, another researcher, Jerry Black, would make another suspicious discovery. He would find that Walters paid Dr. Bruce Maccabee nearly $20,000 and implied that it was to lie about the photos in his research. But Dr. Maccabee denies this, stating that it was only 2 $9,000 payments, made to him after he helped write the introduction on Ed's first book, and was what he called a professional service fee, and that this was 1.5 years after the research was already concluded. But either way, this is concerning to most people, because he was one of the original MUFON investigators that wrote the 90-page paper describing how genuine the case was. This makes many wonder if Dr. Maccabee was profiting from this case the entire time, or was possibly even bribed. But even though this all doesn't really look good on either of them, it doesn't necessarily prove it was a hoax or anything either. Later on, in 1997, Dr. Maccabee would even co-author Ed's third book. On a side note, many feel that Ed was inspired to make his story after reading the book Communion, which did come out just 9 months before Ed's photos first appeared in the newspaper. Not only are the stories somewhat similar, but it's also well known that Whitley Strieber was paid about $200,000 to write his book. Even many years later, many are still unsure if the photos were actually real or not. Although Ed did make a decent amount of money off of all this, many others that have had encounters with UFOs and aliens have done the exact same thing. What really makes this case interesting even today is that both sides of this story are pretty believable. If all the pictures Ed took were fake, then they were done so well that the experts couldn't even prove them to be a hoax. On the other hand, if they were real, then the government, or whoever, did a really good job at discrediting him and spreading doubt. Some even wonder that if this is like some other cases out there, Ed really did take pictures of the craft on a few occasions, but never really got the detail he wanted and ended up faking the other close-up pictures. But even if he did fake his sightings and encounters, there are just so many others made in the area around the same time frame. So in the end, whether or not Ed's photos were real, there definitely was something strange going on in the skies over Gulf Breeze. Even today, the town is still considered a UFO hotspot, with videos and reports still occasionally making national news. If anyone wants to know more about the memories that he recovered through hypnosis, be sure to check out his book, which I'll link down in the description below. But as always, thank you all for watching. please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, as I'm always making more. Be sure to leave a comment too, I'm always interested what you all think about these cases. If audio format's more your thing, this show is also available on most podcast platforms. If anyone wants to show their support, and believe me, I appreciate all the support I get, be sure to check out my Patreon or channel membership page where you can get these videos early and ad-free. And with that said, extra shout out to my members. This was Matt, and I want to believe.